Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is Tom Ricks, and this is the next in a series called The Sins of Silicon Valley. And today we're going to do the final installment, at least so far as I know, on Facebook. And as I've said before, I could talk for hours and hours and hours on Facebook. Facebook could be its own podcast. A podcast that does not... In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere out there is a Facebook, or there is a podcast that criticizes Facebook. There should be. They have 2.8 billion users, and they're by far the most demonic and evil of all of the tech companies. I would hope someone has dedicated their life to bringing down Mark Zuckerberg. I'm just a tourist. But I chose two topics outside of the generic Facebook basically sucks and it's all Mark Zuckerberg's fault for two specific reasons. Right? I chose the last podcast episode on Peter Thiel because the Cambridge Analytica stuff and Palantir is the most egregious abuse of data in Facebook's large repertoire of evil. And it's just gross. And, a lot of times I like to do a podcast episode that I can link to and retweet to somebody that doesn't understand something that would normally take 6 tweets to figure out. And I can just put a link to a podcast episode and figure things out a lot easier that way, right? The reason I chose this episode is because, to me, at the end of the day, this is about what makes Facebook most evil at a personal level, right? At a macro level, Facebook is evil because of how they have helped destroy democracy by giving access to people that spread fake news, a venue to just destroy all trust in the institutions of democracy, to spread conspiracy theories, and in some cases to literally crush the movement of people to fight those forces, particularly in illiberal democracies like Russia or Hungary or Poland or Turkey. But at a personal level, I've lost friends and for brief periods of time, family members, because of stuff that happens on Facebook. In fact, as of right now, aside from the fact that I've deactivated my Facebook account, because who knows what might happen in the future. Mark might be thrown out. Facebook might be ethical. Look, I don't mind that people use Facebook. I think that if you're smart, you avoid it right now. But if you can't, I understand. And the reason I understand is because it is literally addictive, right? Look, even if you have no intention of ever quitting Facebook or deleting your Facebook account, I urge you, especially if you're a daily user, to just take 2 or 3 days to put it down and do a total Facebook cleanse. And by cleanse, I mean also Instagram and WhatsApp or any company owned by Facebook. And I want you to observe how much you want to go back and use it again, right? And that is not an accident. The algorithm that they've made a big deal about in recent congressional hearings is addictive, and it's designed to be addictive. It's called gamification, and Facebook does all kinds of little things to keep you clicking, to keep your eyes on Facebook's screen for as much time as possible. And all kinds of people who are much more intelligent than I am can go on and on about all the things that Facebook does that are insidious about how they manipulate the algorithm to you see less of your family and friends and more garbage news, more advertisements, right? They basically, I find it hilarious that the biggest reason everybody stays on Facebook is because their friends are on Facebook. And they have obscure friends that they would never see in real life that they want to get into an argument about whether a ham sandwich should have mustard or whether it should have tartar sauce, right? I mean, that's basically when you're not arguing about politics or religion, it's typically pedantic stuff, or you get to see some pictures of somebody's cute dog and cute kid. And that's the positive side of Facebook. But the thing is that you cannot get the positive stuff on Facebook without exposing yourself to the negative. And it goes on and on and on, and I can do that. But I could go on about that ad nauseum, and I'm not going to, because other people have done it far better than I have. What I don't see people talking about is the fact that this algorithm is actually psychologically addictive, right? We had a destructive and costly war on drugs in this country for the better part of a century on marijuana, which is, by the way, still going on, which is not addictive, right? Heroin is addictive. Cocaine is addictive. There's a physical reaction when you stop using it. Marijuana isn't. It does have a psychological addiction if you end up having dependency on it. But there's no difference between marijuana psychological addiction and Facebook psychological addiction. I would love to see a placebo study on the withdrawal effects from heroin and the withdrawal effects from Facebook. And I would argue that especially in a minority of the population that has a really high psychosomatic component, right? We all know these people who, if they're ill or they think they're ill, their body starts to physically respond. And I don't think they're faking. I think that the logical explanation to me for that is that there's a close link at their reptile brain between what they imagine is happening and what their body does. I don't know what the biological explanation is, but everybody knows people like this, right? They're not bad people. They're not liars. They are people that just are physically affected by psychological conditions. And sometimes it's the weather, or sometimes it's, people that they have to meet, or PTSD. It goes on. And PTSD is a legitimately diagnosable, treatable illness that has physical ramifications, but is purely from the mind, right? It's the reptile brain, but it's a purely mental condition. Let me throw this out there, right? What is an experiment, right? An experiment is just super quick recourse of Science 101 that you learned in elementary school, right? An experiment is, I have a hypothesis or a theory, like, why is the sky blue? I think the sky is blue because somebody painted it that way. Well, I send a rocket ship up and it goes through the sky, so therefore that is false. There's no paint. I can't find paint, right? That's easy. It's an easily falsifiable theory, right? That's all an experiment is. That's it. A psychological experiment is where you have a theory that has a psychological outcome. I.e., for example, I believe that if I poke this person, they're going to get angry. I poke them, they either get angry or they don't get angry, right? If I want to make an actual scientific study of it, right, I get a control group of 100 people that I don't poke at all. They don't get poked. And they either get angry or they don't get angry, right? But I want to experiment on people, and I poke half of them and I don't poke half of them. And I see, and then I log their reactions. That's it. That's all it is, right? Psychology experiments can get very complex, or they can be very simple. Some of them, if you look at the academic papers, can be almost that simple. And then they go on and on for pages and pages about why that happened. And specifically, how did they get angry, and what's their biochemical component of endorphins, and on and on and on. But my point is this, right? A psychological experiment is an experiment that has a psychological outcome. That's pretty simple to understand, right? So in every state in this country, there is a board of people who are usually psychologists who set guidelines of whether or not you can be a psychologist, right? So, for example, if today in the state of Florida, I decided, you know what, I'm going to be a psychologist today, and got a business license and put out an ad in the paper, they would in X amount of time, whether it's tomorrow or a year from now, sooner or later, somebody's going to say, you know what? I went to Dr. Ricks's office and saw that there's no diploma on the wall. I wonder if he's actually a psychologist. So the board would send somebody down and they check their records and they say, we don't have records of a Dr. Ricks here. And then they would send me a letter probably saying, hey, we don't have records of you. You shouldn't be doing this. You need to apply for a license, right? I mean, it's pretty vanilla stuff, right? But if the DA gets a report of, for example, I have a patient with my unlicensed psychological practice and they kill themselves, well, then the DA has a very good case of throwing me in prison just because I'm an unlicensed psychologist practicing a very dangerous, very personal practice and skill set that requires years and years of training. And that's why we have a board in every state to determine whether or not you are qualified to be a psychologist. Right? And something that every single board in every single state has, check your own state, check the guidelines for that state. I guarantee you that this organization exists, and I guarantee you that one of the parts of their website is regulations for conducting an experiment. The American Psychology Association, or APA, has even more robust regulations for what is considered to be an ethical experiment. Now, why am I going on and on about this? Because as far as I'm concerned, Facebook is conducting the largest, most illegal psychological experiment in the history of mankind. We know this. This isn't speculation on my part. This isn't my imagination. Their own company documents show that they take features like the like button, and they basically randomly select a group of Facebook users and say, okay, if we make this like button blue and we make it orange, what do they do? How long do they take to click it? How do they unclick it? Do we get 20% extra screen time because it's blue and not red? They do this. We know they do this, and it's actually standard practice in the software industry. But what sets Facebook apart from almost every other company is that Facebook does it better than anybody else. Facebook is addictive. And like I said, challenge yourself to see how addictive it is by doing the cleanse for 2 or 3 days and see how much your brain wants to get back on and start making Mark Zuckerberg money, right? Everybody has seen the memes on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else in the world that says you are the product. I made a comment in the first episode about how if you use Facebook, you would take the pill that keeps you in the matrix, right? And I wasn't trying to be mean by saying that. And I also reiterated that until Facebook got personal and in my face and completely disgusting, I also, even though I deleted my Facebook, like root level deleted it 3 times, I still went back as well for the benefits for a lot of benefits, being able to connect to people, being able to see lots of sources of news in one place, being able to advertise. But at the end of the day, it was that ability to advertise as a small business that kept me there. And once they removed that, I no longer, because of the abuse that they've inflicted on me personally, and I'm not going to spend an entire episode ranting about the stuff that they've done, but let's just say Facebook and I have a history. It is personal. I won't lie in any way, shape, or form. It is absolutely personal. Facebook is why I'm doing this entire series. But the fact of the matter is that I still used it until I literally couldn't. So I'm not blaming anybody, but the fact of the matter is that if you use Facebook, you are knowingly participating in an evil situation where they are exploiting you. And that's the same situation as the Matrix. It just is. In the Matrix, people who are told the truth about AIs eating electricity from their brain get to choose whether or not they're going to fight being a slave or they're going to be comfortable and live in reality in a nice little coffin with a tube in their head, feeding them lies. right? And life sucks if you're fighting the AI. So I completely understand in the Matrix why people want never to leave, or in some cases to go back into the Matrix, because life outside the Matrix sucks. Having no ability to see certain friends or see what they're posting sucks. It does. Not having the ability to advertise my podcast, it sucks. I will flat out say it sucks. But here's the thing. Facebook takes this farther than anybody else. And you can still take issue with Facebook in a way that I don't see any regulator approaching this problem. Because I want you to think about this, right? Facebook consults psychologists. They have to. A company that large has to conduct psychologists. They probably even have some on staff, right? And the instant they consult with or employ a psychologist to study the effects of their UI and the addiction thereof, they are legally held to the standards for psychological experiments. Let me give you a parallel example, right? In the Iraq War, right after 9/11, we wanted to torture people, right? America collectively, not everyone, but by and large, we were willing to do whatever it took to hunt down and hurt these bad guys. And so the White House at that time, George W. Bush, said, okay, we're going to go after the bad guys. We're going to get tough. We're going to throw out all the rules that we ever had, and we're just going to torture the hell out of them, and they're going to tell us what their bosses are, and we're going to do whatever it takes to find and kill Osama bin Laden because 2,000 Americans are dead. And the American Medical Association, once word got out about what was going on in these black sites in terms of torture for patients, which was against the Geneva Convention and against the Treaty on Torture, the American Medical Association unequivocally said, you will not retain your medical credentials if you are involved in war crimes, full stop. So if Facebook is consulting or employing in any way a psychologist or even a psychological student who happens to be working in the UI department, and is actively engaging in verifiable experimentation, whether or not they are publishing academic results, they are involved in legally binding, legally prosecutable psychological experimentation. There's a song I like a lot called Alice's Restaurant. And it's an 11-minute song, and the too long didn't read version is it's about this guy who, with his friend, cleans up their friend's house, and they dump some stuff, and they dump it in the wrong place. So a crazy cop basically goes overboard, tries to arrest him. Actually successfully arrests him, but everything's thrown out for comedic reasons. But the fact is that later when they try and draft him, he's not put in the army because he was arrested. And he makes fun of this. But he also says that if I tell people that I can't join the army because of Alice's Restaurant, I'm a crazy person. But if two people do it, it's a movement. And on and on and on and on. And the fact of the matter is, it's actually really true, right? If everybody in a draft starts singing Alice's Restaurant and refuses to be drafted, the army's got a problem, right? There isn't enough jail space to hold millions and millions of people that don't want to be drafted for an illegal war. But my point is this, right? You don't have to quit Facebook to give Facebook a problem. And here's what you need to do to sing Alice's Restaurant to fix Facebook. And like I said, so far as I know, nobody is doing this, right? All you have to do, if you have ever felt addictive or psychological negative effects, such as depression or sadness or frustration at the world and fake news, all you have to do is look up your state board for psychology and say that you have reason to believe that Facebook is conducting illegal psychological research without consulting you in an ethical fashion. In other words, just because you signed a EULA, or an end-user license agreement, doesn't mean that because Mark Zuckerberg says that you sold your soul and your cat and your dog and your kids and any pictures and any copyright you ever own or whatever crap they put in that EULA that people don't read, right? Just because they put something in a EULA doesn't mean that you have given informed consent to be a participant in a psychological experiment. Let me give 2 examples about bad psychological experiments, about why this is regulated, right? The first one, everybody's heard of them, but you might not be familiar with the details, right? The first one is called the Milgram Experiment, and that's really where all this came from. And basically what it is they wanted to check how people respond to authority, right? So in other words, if an authority figure tells you it's okay to shock this guy, how do people respond? And it was pretty astounding that most people, if somebody who seems like they're in charge says it's okay to shock this person, they're okay with it. Now, the shocks in this case were fortunately fake, but the criticism of the experiment was myriad, mainly because people didn't really understand what they were getting into. And you had people that thought that they were administering potentially lethal doses of electricity to people just because a man in a nice suit said he's a bad person and it's okay. And this happens every day in the real world. So this was an invaluable experiment. But the fact is that it made a lot of people uncomfortable. And the main way they justified being uncomfortable was they said, well, the people that participated in this experiment didn't realize what they were doing. So at the end, of course, and the truth is that for the experiment to work, of course, people couldn't be aware of what they were doing. So they were basically trying to prevent experiments that easily show how evil people really can be if an authority figure tells them to do that. But the fact of the matter is that what they actually did was they created a situation where you have to be informed, which is good, because anybody that's familiar with kink or anything else involving sex about the importance of consent. So if you're going to participate in an experiment, then yes, you should consent. But there's a difference between consenting that I'm not going to sue Facebook because my profile isn't the color scheme that I want, or that somebody yells at me on Facebook, right? There's a difference between that and putting that in a EULA and participating in a psychological experiment where Facebook literally knows that making this change to the algorithm is going to cause people significant depression or addiction or anger. And Facebook knows all these things. They know all of these things, and nobody has investigated them, right? Because, first of all, people don't like to investigate tech companies. Everybody loves Facebook. Everybody loves Silicon Valley. I mean, only now are people just starting to look into these companies, right? But here's the thing, right? Unlike Apple, with its company store 30% monopsony garbage, Facebook has violated, in my opinion, and I understand I'm not a lawyer or a psychologist, but I did have basic training in science, and I know psychology when I see it, and I know that regulatory structures exist, and I know that arbitrary district attorneys can and will enforce the law how they want, just like arbitrary Facebook and Twitter censors can and do enforce the rules in totally arbitrary format. But the difference between Facebook and Twitter censors and a DA is that in the court system, as well as the academic experiment system, there's transparency. And the reason there's transparency is so that there's accountability, right? If I'm going to, if I invent a hypno ray right out of science fiction, right? And I can use it to control people's minds, and I start conducting experiments on who the best person to use it on is, and what's the most effective thing to use it, aside from basic assault charges and any other laws that I violate, a prosecutor could easily prosecute me for practicing unlicensed psychology and conducting an experiment without consent, right? So what I'm saying is that Facebook the instant it consults anyone governed by the APA and state chapter guidelines, has clearly violated the law. Now, there's a lot of other companies you could make the argument that, if you have to sign a psychological release every time you give an opinion to a customer review board, right? That opens a whole can of worms. But you know what? I want you to think about this. Have you ever participated in a panel where they ask your opinion, right? Like, do you like this color perfume or do you like this perfume? I've done it a couple times. Most people have. And if you haven't, you've at least seen it on TV, right? And in those instances, you sign a waiver, right? They tell you what they're going to do. They're telling you what to expect. And even in those instances, you are allowed to participate. And I'll make the argument that most other tech companies, as flawed as they are, usually have a beta participation, right? Google, for example, has beta mode. They're notorious for it. And if you want to try out their advanced feature, you buy into it yourself. You get a choice. Facebook does not do that. Facebook just arbitrarily chooses people that are going to try out the new feature and does it because they think they can get away with it, right? And so I would argue that Facebook is unique in its abuse of its customers and its abuse of its employees, because I wanted you to think about this too, because I've never thought about this until just now. If Facebook is going to arbitrarily experiment on its users, why wouldn't Facebook arbitrarily experiment on its employees, right? The poor Facebook support employees have to use a platform, and I wonder how much they've gamified that platform to make people work harder or smarter. Mark Zuckerberg does it with people. Why wouldn't he do it with his own employees, right? My point is this. Oh, and I'm sorry. The other experiment is the Stanford prisoner experiment, and if you're not familiar with it, you should Google it. But suffice to say that both are basically show that people are creepy, and both show that there's a reason why experiments are supposed to be monitored, and Facebook is not. Facebook has none of it. Facebook tries, like every other tech company, to get out from any form of supervision whatsoever, and people are looking into Facebook for things like fake news and all these very difficult areas to regulate because of the First Amendment. But you know what? There are things that Facebook is doing that I don't see anybody looking into and that are very prosecutable. Mark Zuckerberg is a menace to society and the world and our children. Because remember, kids use Facebook, and kids are being psychologically experimented on by bad data. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!